I don't usually go camping alone. I like the quiet, but I also like the security of having someone with me. This time, I made an exception. I needed a break from everything: work, city noise, people. A weekend in the woods seemed like the perfect way to reset. I picked a spot about 2 hours away from home. A state forest, mostly untouched, with only a few designated camping areas. The plan was simple: hike in, set up camp by the lake, fish, cook over a fire, and just exist in nature. The hike in was peaceful. Birds chirped, leaves rustled, and the occasional breeze made the trees sway. The sun was still high, casting warm light through the branches. It felt good to be out there, alone, away from everything. When I reached the lake, I found the perfect spot. A small clearing just big enough for my tent, with a fallen log nearby to sit on. The lake was still, dark, and deep. No one else was around. I set up my tent, gathered firewood, and checked my supplies. Everything was in order. As the sun dipped lower, I started a fire. The crackling flames sent shadows dancing through the trees. I cooked a simple meal: some fish I had caught earlier, seasoned lightly, and a can of beans heated over the fire. Tasted better than anything I had eaten in weeks. The air turned cool. The forest grew quieter. The only sounds were the occasional splash in the lake and the distant call of an owl. I leaned back against the log, staring into the flames, letting my mind wander. Then I heard it. A branch snapped somewhere behind me. I froze, listening. Could have been an animal. The woods are full of them. A deer, maybe. A raccoon. Another snap. Closer this time. I slowly turned my head, scanning the tree line. Nothing but darkness. The fire flickered, casting long shadows. I told myself it was nothing, my mind playing tricks on me. But then I heard breathing. Not mine, not an animal. Slow, measured, human. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it towards the sound. The beam cut through the dark, landing on trees, bushes, nothing else. The breathing had stopped. I stood up, listening. My heart pounded in my chest. Nothing. I turned back to the fire, trying to shake the feeling. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe the wind had carried a distant sound. I forced myself to sit back down. Minutes passed. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see something standing there, just out of reach of the firelight. But there was nothing. I told myself I was being paranoid. I wasn't used to being out here alone. Every little noise felt bigger, more important. Eventually, I crawled into my tent. The fire outside cast an orange glow through the thin fabric. I left the rainfly off so I could see the sky. The stars were bright, clear. I tried to sleep. I really did. But every little sound kept me on edge. Then, just as I was starting to drift off, I heard something again. Footsteps, soft, careful, moving around my tent. I held my breath. My hand tightened around my knife. Whoever it was, they were circling me. I stayed still, listening. The steps stopped. Silence stretched on for what felt like forever. Then the zipper of my tent moved. Just a little, just enough to make a sound. I bolted upright, grabbing my flashlight. I shined it directly at the zipper. Nothing. I waited. My body was tense, heart pounding. I wanted to yell out, but what would I say? Who was I even talking to? After what felt like an eternity, I slowly unzipped the tent myself. I stepped out, knife in one hand, flashlight in the other. The fire had burned low. The woods were quiet. I scanned the area. No footprints. No signs of anyone. But I knew what I heard. I added more wood to the fire, making it bigger, brighter. I sat outside for a long time, staring at the trees, waiting for something, anything to happen. Nothing did. Eventually, exhaustion won. I crawled back into my tent, leaving my knife close. Sleep was light, restless. When the sun finally rose, I stepped outside and checked the ground. No tracks, no signs. Nothing was missing, but something had been out there. I knew it. I packed up quickly, barely eating, and hiked out. Every step felt heavier. Every shadow felt like it held something watching me. When I reached my car, I locked the doors the second I got inside. I never camped alone again. I always liked camping. There was something about being out in the woods, away from everything, that made me feel grounded. No traffic, no phone calls, no noise besides the wind through the trees and the crackle of a fire. It was peaceful. That's what I thought when I packed up my truck and drove out to the National Forest about 2 hours from my house. I had been there before, but this time I wanted to go deeper in. I wasn't staying at a designated campground. I planned to find a quiet spot off an old service road, hike in a bit, and set up camp where I wouldn't see another person for miles. Just me, the trees, and the open sky. I drove down the gravel road, watching the trees blur past as the sun started dipping lower. I had left later than I wanted, but I wasn't worried. I knew I had a good hour before I needed to set up camp. Eventually, I spotted a narrow, overgrown path leading off the main road. It wasn't marked, and it looked like no one had used it in a while. Perfect. I pulled in, my tires crunching over loose rock and dead leaves. The road was rough, full of deep ruts and branches that scraped against the side of my truck. After about 15 minutes, I found a clearing. It was flat, open enough for my tent and a fire, and surrounded by thick woods. A good spot. I got out, stretched, and took a deep breath of the cool air. It smelled like damp earth and pine, that familiar forest scent I always loved. I grabbed my gear and got to work setting up my tent, making sure everything was in place before it got dark. The sun was setting fast now, casting long shadows through the trees. Once my tent was up and my fire was going, I sat back in my camp chair, eating a sandwich and enjoying the quiet. The only sounds were the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant call of an owl. It was peaceful, exactly what I wanted. But then, I heard something else. It was faint at first, barely noticeable over the crackling fire. A low, steady sound, like breathing. Not my own, it was coming from the trees behind me. I turned my head, staring into the darkness. My firelight only reached so far, leaving the rest of the forest pitch black. I listened, holding my breath. Nothing. Probably just my mind playing tricks on me, I thought. The woods had a way of making normal sounds seem eerie when you were alone. I shook it off and went back to eating. The night deepened, the air getting colder. The fire kept me warm, but I knew I needed sleep. I put out the flames, making sure they were completely out, then crawled into my tent. I zipped the door shut, got into my sleeping bag, and closed my eyes. I woke up to a sound, a snapping twig. My eyes opened instantly. It was close, just outside my tent. My heart started pounding. I held my breath, straining to listen. Another step, slow, deliberate, not an animal. I reached for my flashlight, gripping it tightly. I wanted to turn it on, but I hesitated. If someone was out there, I didn't want to give away that I was awake. I waited, my ears locked onto the silence, then breathing, right outside the tent. I stayed completely still, my body rigid. My mind was racing. Who was out here? No one should be this deep in the woods. I hadn't seen another car, another campsite, nothing. A shadow moved across the fabric of my tent. My stomach dropped. Someone was standing there. I gripped my flashlight harder, trying to control my breathing. The shadow didn't move. It just stood there, its shape barely visible in the faint moonlight filtering through the trees. I needed to do something. If I just lay there, I was a sitting duck. I made a split-second decision. I snapped my flashlight on and pointed it at the tent wall. The shadow moved. Fast. I heard running, heavy footsteps crashing through the underbrush, fading into the darkness. I waited, my heart slamming against my ribs. The footsteps disappeared into the distance. I stayed awake the rest of the night, gripping my knife and flashlight, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. The woods were silent again. As soon as the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I was up. I stepped out of my tent, scanning the area. Everything looked the same except for the footprints. They were fresh, leading from the trees right up to my tent. Someone had been there, watching me, standing inches away while I slept. I packed up fast, shoving everything into my truck as quickly as possible. I didn't care about breakfast, didn't care about leaving a clean campsite. I just wanted out. I drove back down the rough trail, glancing in my mirrors every few seconds. My skin crawled the whole way out. I don't know who was out there. I don't know what they wanted. But I know one thing. I'll never camp alone again. I don't know why I agreed to go camping alone. It had been a rough couple of months, and I told myself that I just needed some time away from everything. Some time to clear my head, be out in nature, and get some peace and quiet. Maybe I was trying to prove something to myself, or maybe I just wasn't thinking straight. Either way, I packed up my gear and headed out to a secluded spot deep in the woods. The drive out was uneventful. The last 20 miles were all dirt roads, winding deeper into the forest, the kind of place where if your car broke down, you'd be waiting a long time for help. The further I got, the fewer signs of civilization I saw. No houses, no other cars, just trees and dirt and the occasional rusted out road sign. It was exactly the kind of place I wanted. I found a spot near a small creek and set up my tent. The sun was low in the sky, painting everything in a deep orange glow. The air was crisp, the smell of pine thick around me. It was quiet, too quiet. No wind, no rustling leaves, not even the sound of birds. I tried to ignore it. I told myself I was just not used to this level of stillness. I spent the first hour gathering wood for a fire. I made sure to collect plenty because I didn't want to have to go searching for more in the dark. I got the fire going and sat down to eat. The silence pressed down on me. I kept expecting to hear something. An animal moving in the brush, a distant owl, but there was nothing. After finishing my food, I sat by the fire, staring into the flames. The quiet had settled into something else, something heavier. I told myself it was just my imagination, that being alone out here was making me paranoid. I decided to go to bed early. Lying in my tent, I could hear every little sound. The crackling of the fire outside, the occasional creak of the trees shifting. My breathing sounded too loud. Then I heard it, a footstep. Not a raccoon, not a deer, something bigger. I held my breath, listening. Another step, slow, deliberate. My heart started pounding. I reached for my flashlight and flicked it on, pointing it at the tent wall. I could see the faint outline of something standing just beyond the fabric. It wasn't moving. I lay there, frozen. If I unzipped the tent, I'd have to face whatever was outside. If I stayed inside, I'd just be waiting. I felt exposed, vulnerable. Every instinct told me to stay still, but I couldn't. Slowly, I reached for my knife, gripping it so tightly my hand hurt. The footsteps started again, circling the tent. My mind raced. Was it an animal? No, animals don't move like that. It was a person. But why would someone be out here in the middle of nowhere in the dead of night? I stayed awake for hours, gripping the knife, listening to the footsteps. Eventually, they stopped. I forced myself to wait longer, just in case. Then, just as I started to believe whoever or whatever it was had left, I heard something new. Breathing, just outside my tent. My stomach turned to ice. It was so close. I could hear each slow inhale, each exhale. I squeezed my knife tighter, trying to stay calm. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the breathing stopped. Silence. I waited. I don't know how long, but eventually, exhaustion took over, and I must have dozed off. I woke up to the sun streaming through the tent. My fire had burned out. I sat up, my body aching from how tense I'd been all night. For a moment, I thought maybe I had imagined it all, until I stepped outside. There were footprints, human footprints. They circled my tent over and over. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. My first thought was to get out of there as fast as possible, but a part of me wanted to understand what had happened. Who had been out here? What did they want? I followed the footprints to the tree line where they stopped. No sign of where they went, no broken branches, nothing. It was as if they had just vanished. I turned back to camp, my skin crawling. I packed up my gear as fast as I could. I didn't eat, didn't stop to rest. I just needed to get out. As I threw my pack into the car, something caught my eye, something carved into the tree near my tent. A single word. Stay. I didn't. I don't think I'll ever go camping again. I used to love it. Being out in the quiet, away from everything. Nothing but the sound of the wind moving through the trees and the occasional crackle of a fire. It always felt peaceful, like an escape from everything stressful. But now, just thinking about it makes my stomach tighten because of what happened. It was late summer, and I had taken a few days off work to get away from everything. I needed it. I had been feeling burned out, stuck in the same dull routine every day, and I thought some time alone in the woods would clear my head. I picked a spot I had never been to before, somewhere deeper into the forest than I normally went. I wanted real solitude, no distant sounds of cars, no other campers nearby, just me, the trees, and the quiet. I parked my truck on the side of a dirt road and hiked in about 2 miles before I found the perfect spot. A small clearing with enough space for my tent and a fire pit, but still surrounded by thick woods. There was a small creek nearby, which made it even better. I set up my tent, gathered some wood, and got a fire going. Felt perfect. The sun was still up, casting long shadows between the trees, and the air was warm but not too hot. Felt good to be out there. That first night was uneventful. I sat by the fire, ate some beef jerky and a granola bar, and just listened to the forest. I could hear insects, the occasional rustling in the brush, maybe a deer moving through the trees. Nothing unusual. It was peaceful. I went to bed early, laying in my sleeping bag, feeling the cool air on my face as I drifted off. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of something moving outside my tent. I wasn't scared at first. Wild animals are normal in the woods. Probably just a raccoon or maybe a fox sniffing around. I listened for a minute and the sound stopped. Just the wind in the trees. I closed my eyes again and tried to go back to sleep. Then I heard it again. Slow, deliberate footsteps. Not an animal. Too heavy. Too steady. My heart started pounding. I held my breath, listening. The footsteps moved closer, stopping right outside my tent. I could hear breathing, just barely, but it was there. Someone was standing outside my tent in the middle of the night. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I just laid there, my body stiff, listening. The breathing was slow and deep, not fast or nervous, like someone lost or scared. It was calm, steady. They stood there for what felt like forever. Then I heard them take a step back. Another step, then silence. I stayed awake the rest of the night, gripping my knife in my sleeping bag, listening for any sound. Nothing, just the wind and the occasional creak of the trees. When the sun finally started to rise, I unzipped the tent as quietly as I could and looked outside. Nothing.
No footprints.
No broken branches. Just my campsite exactly as I left it. I convinced myself it was my imagination. Maybe I had dreamed it, half awake, mixing reality with some foggy nightmare. I told myself that, but I didn't really believe it. Still, I wasn't ready to pack up and leave just yet. I had come out here for peace, and I wasn't going to let one weird night ruin that. I shook it off, made some instant coffee, and sat by the fire, trying to enjoy the morning. The second night, I made sure to build a bigger fire. Something about having that light made me feel safer. I sat closer to it, letting the warmth sink into me, watching the flames dance in the dark. I tried to relax, but I kept glancing at the tree line, watching for any movement. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination. I was being paranoid. But then, as I sat there, I heard something in the distance, a branch snapping. Not close, but not far either. My stomach tightened. I held my breath, listening. Another snap. Then nothing. I stayed up for a long time, staring into the dark. But nothing came close.
No footsteps. No breathing.
Just the occasional rustling of leaves. I eventually went into my tent, knife beside me again, and forced myself to sleep. Around 3 a.m., I woke up again. First, I didn't know why. Then I heard it. That breathing. Closer this time. Just outside my tent again. Deep. Slow. I felt like I was going to be sick. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just lay there listening. Then, something pressed against the fabric of my tent. Not hard, just enough that I could see the shape of a hand. Fingers spread out, pressing against the nylon. I wanted to scream. I wanted to jump up, grab my knife, do something, but I couldn't move. I just stared at that hand, barely visible in the dim light of the dying fire outside. It stayed there for a few seconds, then slowly pulled away. I heard footsteps moving back into the trees. Slow, steady, controlled. I didn't sleep after that. As soon as the sky started to lighten, I packed my things as fast as I could. I didn't even eat breakfast. I threw everything into my backpack, stomped out the fire, and started hiking back to my truck. Every few steps, I looked over my shoulder, feeling like someone was watching me, but I never saw anything. When I finally reached my truck, I tossed my gear into the back and locked the doors as soon as I was inside. I sat there for a while, hands gripping the steering wheel, heart still racing. Then, I started the engine and got the hell out of there. I don't know who was out there. Maybe some lunatic living in the woods watching campers, messing with them. Maybe something worse. I don't know, and I don't want to know. All I know is that I'm never camping alone again. Probably never camping at all. Because some things out in the woods aren't just stories. And sometimes when you think you're alone, you're not. I never thought much about fear until that night in the woods. I had camped plenty of times before, usually alone, usually deep in the forest, far from anyone. I liked the solitude. I liked the quiet, but I learned the hard way that sometimes quiet isn't peaceful. Sometimes it's the worst sound of all. It was late October, and I had taken a few days off work to get away. I packed up my gear and drove about 4 hours into a national forest that I won't name, somewhere in the Midwest. It wasn't a popular place, which was exactly why I liked it. No trails, no marked campsites, just endless woods. The kind of place where you could disappear for days and never see another person. I had done it before, and I had no reason to think this trip would be any different. I parked my truck on the side of an old service road and hiked in about 5 miles. I found a spot near a small creek, a clearing just big enough for my tent and a fire. It was a perfect place. Remote, quiet, untouched. The first day went as planned. I set up camp, gathered firewood, cooked some food. By nightfall, I was sitting by the fire, drinking a beer, staring into the flames. The woods around me were alive with the usual sounds: crickets, rustling leaves, the distant call of an owl. It was peaceful. Then, late into the night, the sounds changed. First, it was small things. A sudden silence from the insects, a crack of a branch that didn't quite sound natural. I brushed it off. Woods make noises. Animals move. It's normal. But then, just past the edge of my firelight, I saw movement. It wasn't much, just the briefest flicker of something dark, shifting between the trees. My mind went straight to animals, a deer, maybe a coyote, but something felt wrong. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it into the woods, sweeping it back and forth. Nothing, just trees, shadows, and the flicker of my fire. Still, the feeling wouldn't go away, that instinctive sense that you're being watched. I told myself I was being paranoid, finished my beer, and crawled into my tent. I fell asleep quickly but woke up suddenly. Something had changed. I wasn't sure what, but I was fully awake, heart pounding. The fire had died down, leaving only glowing embers. The woods were silent, too silent. If you've ever spent time in the wilderness, you know what I mean. The absence of sound isn't peaceful, it's unnatural. Then I heard it. Footsteps, not the quick, light steps of an animal. These were slow, deliberate, human. I held my breath, listening. The steps stopped just outside my tent. My mind raced. A ranger? A hunter? Someone lost? But who would be out here, 5 miles from the nearest road, in the middle of the night? And why weren't they saying anything? I reached for the knife I always kept beside my sleeping bag. My fingers tightened around the handle. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The footsteps stayed still for what felt like forever. Then, slowly, they moved again, circling my tent. I felt trapped. My truck was miles away. I had no gun, only my knife. I considered unzipping the tent, jumping out, and confronting whoever it was. But every instinct told me not to, so I waited. The footsteps moved off, fading into the woods. I waited longer, 10 minutes, maybe more. Then I slowly reached for my flashlight and unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. Nothing. I spent the rest of the night sitting up, knife in hand, listening. I didn't sleep. By dawn, I had convinced myself it had been an animal. A big one, maybe a bear, though the steps had sounded too controlled. But I wanted to believe it. So I packed up my gear, made some coffee, and told myself I was being stupid. I should have left. I should have packed up and hiked back to my truck right then. But I didn't. I had planned for 3 nights, and I wasn't going to let a little paranoia ruin my trip. The second night was worse. I forced myself to relax during the day, hiking around, gathering more firewood, doing normal camping things. By nightfall, I had almost convinced myself that nothing had happened, that it had been my imagination. Then, around midnight, the noises started again. First, the same unnatural silence. Then the footsteps, slow, measured, circling the camp. This time, I was ready. I had my knife in one hand, my flashlight in the other. The fire was still burning, casting long shadows through the trees. I listened, my heart hammering in my chest. The footsteps stopped, just beyond the firelight. Then, a sound that made my blood run cold. Breathing. Not heavy, not exaggerated. Just slow, quiet breathing. Someone was standing just beyond the light, watching me. I raised my flashlight and aimed it toward the sound. The beam cut through the trees, but there was nothing there. Just empty woods. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, staring into the darkness, waiting. The footsteps didn't come back, but the feeling never left. To first light, I packed up my gear. I didn't eat. I didn't even bother to put the fire out properly. I just packed up and started walking. Fast. The hike back to my truck felt different. The woods felt different. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone following me. But there was nothing, just trees, shadows, and the endless silence. When I finally reached my truck, I threw my gear in the back, jumped in, and locked the doors. I sat there for a moment, just breathing. Then I started the engine and got the hell out of there. I haven't been back to that forest. I don't plan to. I still don't know who or what was out there that night. Maybe it was just another camper messing with me. Maybe it was someone living out in the woods, avoiding people. Or maybe it was something worse. Someone who had been watching me since the moment I arrived, waiting for the right moment to do something I don't want to think about. All I know is this: I've camped alone dozens of times. I've spent weeks in the woods, miles from civilization. But I've never felt fear like I did that night, and I don't think I ever will again. I always loved camping. There was something about the quiet, the way the trees surrounded me like old friends, the crackle of the fire at night. But after what happened that weekend in the woods, I don't know if I'll ever go back. I had taken the trip alone, something I'd done plenty of times before. I enjoyed being away from everything. No emails, no people, just me and the wilderness. I picked a spot deep in the forest, somewhere I figured wouldn't be crowded. It was mid-September, that perfect time when the summer crowds had died down, but it wasn't too cold yet. The drive out was uneventful. I followed winding back roads until the asphalt turned to gravel, then kept going until I reached the trailhead. From there, it was a couple of miles hike to where I planned to set up camp. The trail wasn't well marked, but I'd studied the map beforehand, and I wasn't too worried about getting lost. I had a compass, a GPS, and enough supplies to last a few days. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. I don't mean peaceful quiet. I mean a deep, unnatural silence. No birds, no rustling leaves, just my own footsteps crunching along the path. That should have bothered me more than it did, but I brushed it off, figuring the animals were just hiding or that maybe I'd arrived during a lull in activity. I hiked in for a few hours, setting up camp near a small clearing beside a creek. It was a beautiful spot. The trees were tall and thick, the water was clear, and there was just enough open space to pitch my tent. I got everything set up: tent staked, firewood collected, food hung up in a tree to keep it safe from animals. By the time the sun started setting, I was feeling good about my decision to come out there. That first night, I sat by the fire, ate my dinner, and just listened to the sound of the creek. Felt nice. I let myself relax, staring into the flames until I started getting tired. I climbed into my tent, zipped up the flap, and fell asleep fast. At some point in the night, I woke up. I wasn't sure why at first. Then I noticed the sound, something moving outside. It wasn't loud, just a soft crunching, like footsteps on leaves. My first thought was that it was an animal, a deer maybe. That wouldn't be unusual. I stayed still, listening. The footsteps moved closer, slow and careful. Too careful for an animal. My stomach tightened. I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on. The thin fabric of my tent glowed dimly, but I couldn't see anything outside. I listened harder. The sound had stopped. I waited, barely breathing. A minute passed. 2. Nothing. Eventually, I convinced myself it was just my imagination. I turned off the flashlight and lay back down. I must have drifted off because the next thing I knew, it was morning. Sunlight filtered through the trees, and everything seemed normal. I shook off the unease from the night before and got on with my day. I spent the afternoon hiking. The forest was dense, but I enjoyed the challenge. I climbed over fallen logs, followed the creek for a while, then made my way back to camp as the sun dipped low. Everything looked the same, but something felt different. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it was like the air had changed, like the forest was watching me. That night, I built another fire and forced myself to relax. I told myself I was being stupid. I camped alone plenty of times. Nothing had ever happened before. But when I got into my tent, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. I woke up again in the middle of the night. This time I knew why. The footsteps were back. Closer this time. I held my breath, listening. Then I heard something worse, the sound of breathing. Slow, deep breaths, just outside my tent. My whole body tensed. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. I just lay there, gripping my flashlight, waiting for something to happen. Then the zipper on my tent moved. Not much, just a little tug, like someone testing it. Panic surged through me. I shot up, clicking on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, but by the time I unzipped the tent and shined it outside, there was nothing there. Just the trees, the fire's dying embers, and the empty woods. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I looked around my campsite. There were no footprints, no broken branches, nothing to prove I hadn't imagined the whole thing. But I knew what I had heard. I decided I'd had enough. I packed up my gear, threw everything in my backpack, and started hiking back. The whole way out, I felt watched. Every time I stopped to rest, I thought I heard something in the distance. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling. But every time I turned around, there was nothing there. I made it back to my car without incident, but I never felt safe until I was miles away from that place, speeding down the highway back to civilization. I don't know what was out there with me, and I don't want to know. All I know is I won't be going back. I don't think I'll ever go camping alone again. I've always liked the quiet of the woods, the way the trees stretch up and swallow the sky, the way the wind moves through the branches like whispers in an empty room. But after what happened last fall, I don't think I can ever enjoy it the same way again. I took the trip to get away for a bit, just me and the wilderness. I had picked a spot deep in the Hoosier National Forest, far off any well-traveled trails. I wasn't interested in bumping into other campers, hearing their music, or dealing with their mess. I wanted complete solitude. I found a location near a small, still lake, just a clearing with enough space to pitch my tent and set up a fire ring. I had brought enough supplies to last me a few days: food, water, a decent first aid kit, and my hunting knife. I don't carry a gun, never felt the need for one. The first night was uneventful. The fire crackled low, sending up the occasional pop of burning wood. I sat there, listening to the forest sounds: crickets, the distant hoot of an owl, the rustling of unseen creatures in the brush. Nothing out of the ordinary. I turned in early, crawled into my sleeping bag, and let the quiet lull me to sleep. It was the second night when things started to feel wrong. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just a feeling. The kind of feeling that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up, like you're being watched. I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to my imagination, but it gnawed at me. I kept looking up from my fire, scanning the darkness, expecting to see something. But nothing was there, just trees, thick and shadowed under the moonlight. At some point, I must have dozed off in my camp chair because I woke up to the sound of twigs snapping. My fire had burned down to red coals, just enough to give me a faint glow of light. The sound had come from behind me, deeper in the woods. Deer, I told myself, maybe a raccoon, but my gut twisted in a way I couldn't ignore. I stayed still, listening. Then I heard another noise, this one closer. A low, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled through the leaves. My stomach turned. I had my flashlight within reach, so I grabbed it and flicked it on, sweeping the beam through the trees. Nothing. The sound had stopped. I listened for another minute, heart hammering, but all I heard was the wind. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was just freaking myself out. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I made sure my knife was close and got into my tent, zipping it up tight. It didn't feel like much protection, but it was all I had. I lay there in the dark, listening, waiting. At some point, I must have fallen asleep because the next thing I knew, I was waking up to dead silence. No crickets, no wind, nothing. Just an unnatural stillness pressing in from all sides. Then, a sound just outside my tent. A soft, deliberate exhale. I stopped breathing. My hand clenched around my knife handle. The fabric of the tent barely separated me from whatever was standing inches away. I stayed as still as I could. The breath came again, slow and measured. Then I heard it step away. One step, two, then silence. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning, I had almost convinced myself it had been an animal. Maybe a bear sniffing around my tent. Maybe my own mind playing tricks on me. But when I stepped out of my tent, I saw them. Footprints. Human footprints. They circled my campsite, pressing deep into the damp earth. I felt sick. I had hiked miles off the main trails, set up camp in an area no one should have had any reason to be. But someone had been there, watching me. I packed up fast. Didn't eat, didn't even make coffee. Just threw everything into my pack and started moving. I kept my knife in my hand, my ears straining for any sound. The hike back felt twice as long, every snapped twig making my pulse jump. I didn't stop, didn't rest, just kept moving. When I finally made it back to my car, I locked the doors the second I was inside. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. I looked back at the tree line, half expecting to see someone standing there, watching me. But there was nothing. I never reported it. What would I have said? There was no crime, nothing concrete to tell. Just footprints in the dirt, a feeling in my gut. But I know what I felt. I wasn't alone out there, and I don't think I ever was.